Today I've got Paul Linsell with me, and we're going to be speaking about that question of the COVID vaccine and what happens if you're divorced or co-parenting and one of you is all up for getting the child vaccinated or children vaccinated and your ex isn't. What do you do in that situation?
Yes, it's a difficult one, I think, for a lot of people. So it's presenting legal issues that people need to explore.
So have you had many queries about this already?
There have been some. I think the general, I suppose, query that I get is either can I be forced to have my child vaccinated when people perhaps don't want to, or as you say, if people are sort of separated or co-parenting in a different situation and there's a dispute and they don't really know whose view will prevail or what will happen in those circumstances. So there are some inquiries coming through already. I suspect there will be more as the sort of programme really takes off. So
who decides if your child gets the vaccine?
It's a difficult question. I think the first thing is it depends on the age of the child. So if the child is 16 or over, then that child will be able to make the decision for themselves. So they're deemed to have their own competency to make that choice. So it's relatively straightforward if a child's 16 or over. Currently the window is the 12 to 15-year-olds. So the vaccination is only currently being offered for over 12. It may go younger, depending on what the government decides. But for those younger children, so 15 and under, it could be the child themselves, it could be the parents or anyone with parental responsibility, or it could potentially even be a court if there is a dispute over what to do. So it depends on different circumstances, but the starting point with all of that will be, has that child got the ability to make that decision for themselves? Because obviously if a child as an individual has that ability, then that's what will happen. And there's a concept known as Gillick competency, which originates from a case many years ago, really to determine whether a child is capable of consenting to medical treatment, of which the vaccination would fall under. So if the child can be shown to be Gillick competent, then ultimately that child has the ability to make the decision for themselves. So that's the starting point, really.
So is that used if you go to court, you wouldn't, or would you be looking at that as two parents at that Gillick competence? Is that only sort of come up if you end up in the court forum?
So really, I suppose Gillick competency is only going to come up if a child is in dispute with their parents. So you could have a situation where the parents are perhaps saying either they want the child to be vaccinated or maybe they don't want the child to be vaccinated, and the child is saying something different. If the child is shown to be Gillick competent, then ultimately the child can overrule the parents' views. So you could, I suppose, technically you could have a legal dispute between child and parents, and I think ultimately the court would then need to determine whether that child is Gillick competent. But I think in practice it's more likely that the actual medical professionals who are administering the vaccine will be the ones to determine in the first instance whether the child is Gillick competent or not. Yeah, so I think in terms of who would make that initial assessment as to is a child Gillick competent or not, it's possible that those that are actually administering the vaccine, potentially even on the day, might be the ones making that choice. Now, I think if a child is refusing the vaccine on the day, the reality is, I think even if a child isn't Gillick competent, I can't really imagine a situation where a child's going to be held down and vaccinated if they're clearly not wanting to do it. So I think in those circumstances, it would be referred back to the parents in the first instance anyway. But if a child has been, if the parents have said to say to school that actually they don't want the child to have the vaccine, but the child is then saying they do, I suspect there'll be some processes in place before it just sort of happens without the parents knowing. But ultimately, if it came down to it and that child is Gillick competent, then the child can essentially make the choice for themselves and decide to have the vaccine.
So it could be a situation in, say, a senior school with a 15-year-old, all their friends are going to get it. The child knows that one parent is for it, one is against it, but they get in the queue and say they want it, but their name's not down on the list. So maybe the medical professional just say, well, you want the vaccine? Yes, I do. And yeah.
It's possible, yes. I mean, I think it remains to be seen really how that will work in practice. I suspect there will be mechanisms that a school puts in place. So I'm aware that the consent of people with parental responsibility is being sought regardless. So they're not really sort of looking at GILIC competency first. I suppose it's then only going to be those situations where consent hasn't been given, or actively they've said they don't want the child to have a vaccine. In those circumstances, if a child is then saying that they do, I suspect there'll be, as I say, a mechanism for dealing with that to start with. But yes, in theory, that child could join the queue on the day, and if the medical professional says, yeah, I'm satisfied that this child knows what they are doing, and they satisfy the GILIC competency test, then yes, that child could be vaccinated.
Also, you can end up with a situation where the school, they're obviously going to ask both parents. So you've got one who doesn't reply and doesn't give consent, and one who does, and then the child's in the queue, so they use that other parent's consent. Yeah, but it sort of remains to be seen, really, doesn't it? And it may differ in different schools, and yeah.
Yes, I think there's a lot of still question marks, I suppose, over exactly what will happen. But I mean, that situation and the GILIC competency situation, that's no different to any other vaccine that's existed. So I don't think the situation is any more or less difficult than other childhood vaccinations that have been administered through schools.
Yeah. So if you've got a couple who really, one is for, one's against, and they really can't agree, what would you suggest they do?
I suppose the first thing they've got to do is understand their own views, because I think the situation with the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, is a difficult one. I think the guidance that's out there isn't particularly clear cut, and it even admits itself that it isn't a clear cut decision. So I think there are various things that people should probably read to understand their own views. But then if it's a case of, okay, people are still of those views, and you've got one parent that says they do want it and one parent that says they don't, I suppose the first question is still, what does the child think? Because, again, going back to the GILIC competency point, if the child is GILIC competent, it frankly doesn't much matter what the parents think. Ultimately, the child can say, no, I'm doing this, or no, I'm not doing this. So the child could overrule it. I suppose if the child isn't GILIC competent, that's where you have the potential for a dispute between the parents that will ultimately then determine whether a child gets the vaccine or not. And if the parents can resolve that dispute, then obviously that's what will happen. If they can't, I suppose, default position is that the vaccination probably won't be given. So Public Health England guidance will state that if there is a parent that is not consenting to the vaccine, or I should say is actually actively opposing the vaccine, then they won't vaccinate until that dispute is resolved. So there are options for trying to resolve it. Ultimately, there is a court process that can resolve that, but it's a difficult one. I think it's very hard for parents to know really what to do in the first place, but particularly in circumstances where they don't agree, how to resolve that disagreement. It's challenging.
And also, it could take some time to get to court. That's the other thing, isn't it?
It could, and I suppose people should be looking at other processes. Ultimately, if it was to come to court, it's most likely to be under an application for what's known as a specific issue order. So asking the court to make a determination on a specific issue. If that's the case, that court process could take a long time. I mean, you're going to have 5 or 6 weeks from the making of the application until you have the first court hearing. If it's still disputed at that first court hearing, it's not actually going to be resolved at that point. It's going to be at a later court hearing. You may have to get medical evidence involved. You may have to do reports on the wishes and feelings of the child. You may also have to get further directions for statements from both parents and so on. So there could then be a lot of work that goes into that issue, and it could be months before the court makes a determination. So I think parents look at other options. So there are other processes that can be used. So first of which would be mediation. So parents could go to a mediation with the assistance of a skilled mediator to try and explore those issues. You could get the child's wishes and feelings fed into that process using what's known as child inclusive mediation, and then hopefully make a decision that everybody is okay with. If that's not possible, there's also the option of arbitration. So you could actually appoint someone to make that decision, and that can obviously speed everything up and hopefully get the decision quicker so that the child and everyone else knows where they stand.
Well, thank you very much for all your advice and tips today. Well, that's been great, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from you over the coming months and years as you give us your expertise here at the Group Hug. So thank you very much.
Thank you.